Hello everybody, welcome to this AHURI webinar. My name is Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI and it's my pleasure to be your host and MC for our session today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which all of you are working and joining us from today, and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining and participating in this webinar. I'd also like to celebrate the diversity of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and their ongoing cultures and connections to lands and waterways. Before we jump into our webinar today, and it's the first one that we've had in a little while, I'm pleased to announce a few other upcoming events for 2024, and we kick off the year next year with another webinar on the 29th, which is looking at adapting our cities and towns to climate change. In May, we will run a one-day conference in Sydney on the circular economy, which will look at a piece of research that we published earlier this year on that topic. And then, of course, our big conference, the National Homelessness Conference 2024, is being held at the Adelaide Convention Centre in August next year. Further details and registrations for these events will be coming out soon, so do keep up to date by subscribing to AHURI News and following us on our social media. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a moment, but before I do, I'll familiarise you with the platform that we're using for the webinar today and how you can participate in this webinar through asking questions and so forth. So you will, well, firstly, I want to say the webinar is being recorded. So after the event, if you are registered for the webinar and you want to return to it or to forward it on, share the link with colleagues, you may do so. It will be available on the AHURI website in coming days. And at the end of the webinar, you will also receive a survey, and we'd welcome your feedback on today's webinar so that we can continue to refine and improve our offerings in the future. How to participate in today's webinar. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a panel and down the side, and on that you have a few options. One of those is a Q&A tab at the top, and if you click on that, then you are able to present your questions by typing them there during the presentation. Please submit those at any time. We'll collate them and we'll attempt to address as many of them as we can, and I will apologise in advance because I know that it's often very difficult to get through everybody's questions, so I will let you know straight up that I won't be getting through all of them, but I will look to ask as many as I can, and certainly to note the issues and themes that are being raised so we can make sure that we discuss those. There's also a chat function on the next to the Q&A tab, and we have that open today. That will enable you to share your thoughts and comments with other participants in the webinar, and you again, just do that by typing in there. And you may want to kick off the chat by perhaps saying what particular lands you're joining us from today. Okay, well, I now want to focus in on our topic today and our presenters. And I'm delighted to welcome you then to this webinar on supporting first home buyers, opportunities and challenges of that. And our presenter is Professor Stephen Whelan from the University of Sydney. Stephen was the lead author of AHURI's report on this topic, which was called Financing First Home Ownership, the Opportunities and Challenges, and it examines the challenges of financing to buy a first home. This was a very major project, and it incorporated 4 supporting research projects which focused on socioeconomic developments and policy settings across Australia that impact access to home ownership, and particularly first home ownership. The report and the policy evidence summary that accompanies that, along with a standalone executive summary, are now all available in the handout section of the webinar today. And again, next to the chat and the Q&A, you'll see a handouts tab. And if you click on that, you are able to open and download those documents. And again, they are all available through the AHURI website, and you can access them at any time freely in the future. Stephen Whelan, now, to introduce him, is the Associate Dean at the School of Economics at the University of Sydney. He has held several positions at the university since 2002. He is a very accomplished applied economist and has expertise in labour markets, in housing economics and in microeconomics. Stephen has successfully participated and led a series of AHURI projects and has collaborated with a range of experts and policymakers across housing-related projects, particularly related to intergenerational transfers, to labour mobility, and also to the question of downsizing amongst older Australians. So Stephen will present to us in just a moment, but before he does so, I will at this moment introduce our other presenters who will, I guess, join Stephen to form a bit of a panel at the end of the presentation. We'll hear from them, and we'll also then be able to ask questions of all of the people on the panel. So our first panelist along with Stephen is Eliza Owen. And Eliza is the head of research at CoreLogic Australia. Prior to joining CoreLogic, Eliza spent almost a decade as a housing market researcher working for both the Domain Group and Residex. And she has reported extensively on key issues related to housing in Australia. You may have heard her on the radio or other media doing exactly that. And we also welcome Dr. Marcus Spiller, who will also be our second respondent and panellist today. Marcus is a founding partner of SGS Economics and Planning. He has practiced mainly as a consultant, but has also worked as an academic and as a senior bureaucrat in both state and Commonwealth governments. He is an expert in regional economic development, housing policy, infrastructure funding, and in metropolitan governance. And he's also part of the interim National Housing Supply and Affordability Group. The format for today's webinar will include the presentation by Stephen, followed by two short responses by firstly Eliza and then Marcus. And then after that, we'll all come together on the screen and join you in a bit of a discussion around the issues that have been raised. And that's where I'll be bringing your questions to the table for consideration as well. Again, please do pop those questions in at any time during the presentation. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Stephen Whelan to present to us on this topic. Thank you.
So thanks, Tom. I hope everyone can hear me. And let me just begin by thanking you and AHURI for the opportunity to talk about the research today. I'll talk a little bit about the context of that and then sort of delve into, I say, some of the findings, some of the observations, I suppose, that we made throughout the inquiry. So the seminar today, or the webinar today, is around supporting first home buyers, the good, the bad, and the unintended consequences. The inquiry itself was, I suppose, focused on financing first home ownership. The final report was titled Opportunities and Challenges around financing first home ownership. The inquiry itself, I do need to acknowledge, and very thankful of AHURI's support to conduct the inquiry. As Tom mentioned, there was actually 5 separate reports associated with the inquiry. If you like, 4 substantive research projects. One was led by Lawrence Troy here at the University of Sydney. One was led by Hal Paulson at the University of New South Wales. And the final one was led by Rachel Long from Curtin University. And so I do want to acknowledge those colleagues who contributed to the report. Now, as is traditional here at the University of Sydney, when we start our presentations, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm presenting from today, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I do want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, as I mentioned, the inquiry itself was, actually turned out to be a multi-year challenge, I suppose, because of the challenges around COVID, amongst other things, which had various components. some of which I'll speak to today, but I'll be honest and say that what I've done is, in a sense, cherry pick some sort of key observations and key findings from the inquiry and the reports which contributed to it, in part to hopefully really generate some discussion. I'm sure there will be lots of discussion and helpful comments about financing first home ownership, those challenges and opportunities. So let me begin by sort of providing a little bit of context, I suppose, which is really about home ownership, which we think of, and we certainly noted in the report, is truly an enduring aspiration of many Australians. And we can look to where sort of the genesis of that is, so to speak. And often people point to the forgotten people speech of the then Prime Minister Robert Menzies in 1942, or was Prime Minister around that time, I should say. And in particular, speaking around the benefits of home ownership. And, perhaps the notion of home ownership and the attraction of it is encapsulated more than anything in that term, the Great Australian Dream. One of the things I think which really became apparent to us as we worked through the inquiry is that when we look at, policies which are being directed or, formulated to enable home ownership, it has been an explicit policy aim of governments of all political persuasions at both state and federal levels, at least since the mid-20th century, if not earlier. And I'm going to suggest, perhaps controversially or not, that I think perhaps part of the problem and part of the challenge is that there's been a lot of bipartisanship around home ownership, and in particular the policies which have been put in place to enable it. But that's something we'll return to a little bit later. Why home ownership, and why might we want to encourage home ownership? Well, clearly it has some very desirable benefits and features. Perhaps the most important one is that it provides that security of tenure, which other tenures don't actually provide. And so from an individual or household perspective, it provides an opportunity to in a sense put down to roots in a community or neighbourhood, and not have that fear of being turfed out, so to speak. And from an economics perspective, one of the other things which is has been identified in the literature, and we talk about it in the inquiry, is that arguably that there's externalities or benefits which accrue not just to the individual but also the neighbourhood more generally through home ownership. And you can broadly think about those as, if somebody owns a property or owns their own home, they might be more civic minded, and that has implications for not just the individual but the neighbours around them. One thing I would say about that is that those supposed externalities, positive externalities, are often identified as a reason why governments should support home ownership and enable it. But those externalities shouldn't be uncontested. It is, I think, a point of debate whether or not they're real and how large they are. Also, in the Australian context, home ownership as a means of savings and wealth accumulation is an extraordinarily important aspect, or one of the benefits, if you like, of that particular form of tenure. Now, it also comes with costs. And in particular, we can think about owning your own home as, investing, so to speak, in a very illiquid asset, I should say, and it comes with high mobility costs. And it's often lost in much of the debates about home ownership in Australia and rising house prices, but it's also the case that it can be risky, and it does expose individuals to risk. Now, there's certainly other benefits and costs associated with home ownership, but let me just put those on the table for the moment and move on. And where I want to move to is sort of the experience around home ownership in Australia, which is a story that probably many of us are familiar with. There was a rapid expansion of owner occupation in the post-war period, and I've mentioned here that home ownership peaked at around 70% of the population in the 1960s or so. There's, I won't say debate, but depending on how you measure home ownership, then sometimes that timeline moves around in terms of where home ownership peaked. But certainly at its peak, the easiest way to think about it was that approximately 70% of households were in home ownership, 25% or 1/4 of households were in the private rental market, and approximately 5% were in social housing. Now, it's also important to emphasise, because this is often lost in debates around home ownership, but we often think about Australia as being a high home ownership country, but in fact, we're pretty average, at least with respect to the OECD. There's countries which have higher home ownership rates and certainly countries which have lower home ownership rates. Now, from that peak in the 60s or 70s, what followed was a decline in home ownership rates, and particularly since 2000, if not earlier. A story I'm sure that many of us have heard is that the decline was particularly pronounced amongst younger adults or younger cohorts. And I'll have some slides in a moment which really demonstrate that very, very starkly. But we can see, for example, that the home ownership rate for those aged between 25 to 34 actually fell from approximately 51% in 2000 to about 44% in 2021. And in fact, coming off their peak, this fall was substantially larger. Now, there might be many good reasons why this decline occurred. A lot of those related to social and demographic developments. Things like attainment of education or higher education, which delays that transition to home ownership, delays in fertility decisions, and the formation of an independent household. There's also other reasons. Traditionally, home ownership has been a way to accumulate wealth and save. And with the development of superannuation in the 1990s, other opportunities became available to do so. So there might be other reasons. So I've talked about those as, in a sense, good reasons why we might see declines in home ownership. But there's also what I suppose many people point to as bad reasons for this decline, and they're often associated with affordability. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about affordability later, but at this point, I'd simply say that affordability is quite a nebulous concept, but I'll return to that a little bit later. So I mentioned that there was this decline in home ownership rates, and I've got two graphs here which really capture that story in similar but different and importantly different ways. So the first graph here, which was taken up from one of the reports which formed part of the inquiry, just shows what's happened to those age-specific home ownership rates over a 40-year period. And we can see that, in the 25 to 34-year-old age group, and likewise the 35 to 44-year-old age group, there's been a systemic decline in home ownership rates over time. What this really also highlights is, notwithstanding this decline in the home ownership rate of those younger cohorts, what's happened is that the home ownership rate overall has remained relatively steady and declined only marginally. And part of the reason of that is because of the aging of the population. So those older cohorts have much higher home ownership rates, and as those cohorts have aged, the higher home ownership rate in those older cohorts has, in a sense, supported overall home ownership rates. The second graph that I want to show you, which again comes from one of the reports which form part of the inquiry, is something which shows how at different ages, how the home ownership rate has declined for successive cohorts. Now, I'll be honest and say there's far too many numbers and too many lines on this diagram, but there's some key messages that you can see by just looking at that pattern of lines, so to speak. And the first is that, you sort of see a rapid increase in home ownership rates as individuals age from 20 right through to their 50s and 60s and 70s. And, we can see that just in that sort of shape where it tends to increase over time in terms of the age of a household. Perhaps more importantly, though, these different lines represent different birth cohorts. And though there's lots of information on the graph itself, what's clear is that the more recent birth cohorts at any given age are far less likely to retain home ownership than their parents or their grandparents. And you can see that because those lines, which form part of this diagram, are in a sense shifting down for more recent birth cohorts. And sort of that's one of the key messages, I suppose, that came out of the inquiry, although it's not really a new message, which is that younger cohorts, those who have been more recently born, so to speak, are finding or not attaining home ownership rates at the same level as their parents at the same age. Now, I mentioned or alluded to one of the bad reasons, so to speak, as to why home ownership rates might be declining, in particular might be declining amongst younger age groups. Now, I've just taken one small snapshot, and I'm going to come back to another similar one, which is far more focused on Sydney and Melbourne later. But what I want to highlight here is that what we observe over time is arguably a decline in affordability of home ownership. Now, the way we've measured home ownership here, or sorry, affordability here, I should say, is by comparing the dwelling prices to household income ratios. And one way to think about this is a heat map, and the hotter it is, the worse it is. And in general, what we've observed over time is that, in a sense, things got hotter, i.e., that the dwelling price relative to household incomes has been increasing over time. And that's a simple way. It's not necessarily the best way or the most correct way to capture that decline in affordability over time. The other thing I'd mention here, and I think this is a really important message, is that even some regions, some parts of Australia, which had very high dwelling price to income ratios, for example, in 2016 and 2011, actually, so to speak, came off the boil. So house prices can in fact come down. And I suppose that's one thing we often fail to sort of appreciate, but it does happen. Now, it's not the pattern in many places in Australia, but it certainly does happen. But the takeaway from here is that, at a very high level, if we can think about affordability, arguably it's declined over time. So some initial takeaways before I move on to a few things. So one thing I'd say is that developments in home ownership over the past couple of decades are complex. There's many factors which have contributed to changes in home ownership rates. And there's no one single narrative which would explain what's happened or indeed how to address it. We do know that home ownership rates have fallen, but perhaps not by as much as has been perceived, and that's partly because of the ageing of the population. Where the home ownership rates have declined substantially is amongst those younger cohorts, so 25 to 34-year-old age groups. One of the really important findings in the inquiry is that this is not simply a case of delayed entry into home ownership. Some of the analysis we did found that as individuals age, they do tend to, enter or have a greater likelihood, I suppose, of entering home ownership, but they're not catching up to where their parents were. So you can think about those, for example, who were, there's a gap between the home ownership rates for 25 to 34-year-olds compared to their parents when they were 25 to 34-year-olds. And that gap closes as they age, but it doesn't close completely. And the key lesson from that is that it's not simply a case of delayed entry into home ownership. There's a sizable part of the cohorts, the younger cohorts, who appear never likely to get into home ownership. This has important consequences as individuals enter or transition into retirement. We know, for example, that there's a very, very, very high correlation between home ownership and your welfare in retirement. And lack of home ownership is highly correlated with poverty. We also found in the quantitative or qualitative analysis, I should say, in the inquiry, that Australian households still aspire and see home ownership as, as part of the Australian cultural landscape, so to speak. It's an important part of the Australian psyche. I've mentioned previously that affordability is a nebulous concept, and I can talk more about that, and I'm sure that we will move on to that discussion. Perhaps most importantly, though, and I haven't really spoken about this much at all to this point, is that I would argue that some, perhaps many, if not all, of the problems we face with respect to transition to home ownership and the affordability challenge, so to speak, are of our own making. Because what they do is they reflect the policy choices that our politicians, our governments have made. So let me move on briefly and talk about some of those choices. And I've said here, perhaps said bad policy choices, but I think that's something that we need to sort of really debate and discuss. We know that support for aspiring homeowners has been a feature of Australian political and policy landscape for many decades. Over time, that support has evolved. And indeed, the post-war support and actions by government were very different. I'd argue it was a different world back then. And, I mentioned here the 1980s, and I'm old enough to remember the 1980s and some of the changes around deregulation of the financial system. And, for example, changes in the ability of banks to lend to aspiring homeowners, the interest rate caps which were in place then, which were removed, changes in the financial landscape, for example, the loss of building societies, which likewise supported home ownership aspirations of Australian households. The key lesson that we took from our inquiry, though, was that in the past, there was a much greater focus on supply side, i.e. policies that could fund or otherwise enable the production of housing suitable for a cohort of first-home buyers. More recently, post-1980s, although there were aspects of it predating the 1980s, demand-side measures, which were designed to boost the purchasing power of first-home buyers, became much more common and, as you'll see, much more pervasive throughout the housing policy framework. Now, I suppose one of the things I want to emphasise, and this is where hopefully we'll get lots of discussion about this today, is that these choices have been made, and they're our choices, or the choices of governments. And what they've encompassed is this significant shift from supply side to demand side measures. And in particular, we can think about stamp duty concessions and things like the first homeowners grants. One of the figures that I've pulled out of the inquiry is the size or the magnitude of those expenditures. They exceed $37 billion on those demand side measures, stamp duty concessions, first homeowners grants, over the past 5 decades in direct grants and tax concessions targeted at first home buyers. Now, I've given a slide here which actually lists the per capita expenditures on those types of measures over the past 50 years or so. Now, just a couple of points about this is that you'll see that there's peaks and troughs. Those peaks and troughs coincide with things like the GFC, when there was substantial increases in the first homeowners grants, for example, afforded to aspiring homeowners. And those policy measures at that point were, designed, one, to help first home buyers, but they also had other aims. So, for example, supporting the macroeconomy or supporting the construction sector. The other thing to note is that if we look at the GFC, some of the very simple back-of-the-envelope calculations that we did around those measures during that time, the first homeowners grant, suggests that rather than actually increasing the entry into home ownership by aspiring first home buyers, it simply brought it forward. So over a period of 5 or 6 years, pre and post GFC, and the very large stimulus in terms of first homeowners grants which were available, it didn't actually make a real difference or a substantial difference to home ownership rate. It simply brought that entry into home ownership forward. So these demand side policies are ubiquitous, but there's very good reasons to question them. We know from a very simple theoretical model that these grants are likely to be capitalised into prices, and those higher prices benefit existing, not aspiring owners. There's lots of evidence that suggests that they change the timing, but not the attainment of home ownership. And indeed, if we look at what's happened over time, notwithstanding those very significant expenditures, home ownership rates have generally continued to decline amongst younger cohorts. Now, we don't know what the counterfactual would have been. We don't know what would have happened in the absence of these policies. But the evidence and indeed the theoretical framework suggest very clearly that these have not really helped those households, those Australians, those young Australians aspiring for home ownership that they were designed to help. And it's also important to understand or note that these policy settings are simply one in a suite that contribute to and influence housing and home ownership choices. We can talk about stamp duty, I'm sure that'll come up later, capital gains tax treatment of housing, negative gearing rules. We could also talk about the treatment of housing in the transfer system. So Let me just return very briefly to the issue of affordability. And I've channeled Charles Dickens and talked about A Tale of Two Cities. I do come from Sydney and I spent a little bit of time in Melbourne, but it's not for that reason, but simply to highlight how much hotter, so to speak, the property markets have become here and how much more challenging the affordability challenge has become for aspiring first-home buyers. So again, this is a measure of affordability using the dwelling price to income ratios, Sydney to 2001 to 2021, clearly much hotter over a 20-year period. It's a similar, although perhaps not quite as pronounced, story in Melbourne. Now, I want to emphasise those simply because affordability, it turns out, is not an easy concept to actually define. There's lots of factors which feed into affordability. Some of those are exogenous, things like interest rates, the price of dwellings, but there's also other endogenous factors. So choices around housing quality and quantity, location. All of those factors determine what is affordable. In the inquiry, we made the distinction between accessibility, and we think about that as the deposit or the down payment constraint, versus affordability, i.e. the ongoing requirement that a homeowner make repayments. What policy's increasingly done very recently is recognise that accessibility is really a key challenge facing aspiring first-home buyers. Those sugar hits from past policies like first homeowner grants actually haven't, well, I'd argue, worked and are likely to have been counterproductive. So what's happened? Well, I would say it's a good step, a good development, but there have been some alternatives which have been put in place over the past few years which address that accessibility issue or challenge in a far more direct and targeted way. Things like the first home buyer's guarantee, which allows an eligible home buyer to essentially enter into home ownership with a relatively low deposit, 5%. And there's other variants of that scheme. Certainly the evidence is that, once you're on that home ownership ladder, then the first step is the hardest and it becomes easy from there. And this arguably facilitates that first step. There's also other options to consider, things like shared equity schemes, such as the Help to Buy slated to start in 2024. And I really point to those as developments which are in place or occurring, which are a step away, I suppose, from more recent policies of the past few decades, which arguably we see as a result of the inquiry as being a positive step forward, arguably better or good policy choices. Now, as an economist, and my training is in economics, I cannot not talk about unintended consequences, particularly given the title of today's talk. So what are some of the unintended consequences of focusing on home ownership? Well, as I mentioned earlier, home ownership per se is an objective, I would argue, is a poor one. It exposes individuals to risk. We don't often think about house prices falling or dwelling prices falling, but they can. It also potentially exposes the macroeconomy to risk. And I would simply point to the experience of the United States during the global financial crisis as an abject lesson in why we don't want to focus on home ownership and increasing it as a policy objective in and of itself. What's more, those policy choices that seem appealing often garner bipartisan support, can be misguided. Point to first homeowner grants and stamp duty concessions. There's often discussion around things like prudential regulations that seek to limit borrowing capacity and therefore asset and house price inflation. They can potentially harm or at least not help first home buyers who often are faced with a relatively low level of savings and therefore rely on financing to actually access home ownership. Something which is, I suppose, dear to my heart is that we think about tax settings, and I mentioned capital gains, but there's many others, that spill over beyond their intended domain. And that could be negative gearing, and something I'm sure that we'll talk about in today's discussion. So let me just think about, summarise by a few final comments. Home ownership can be good. I do believe we've made some bad policy choices over time. I'd argue that those past policy choices and even current ones can have unintended consequences that we really need to be aware of in formulating policy going forward. Home ownership is a complex challenge because it has so many dimensions. Those policies ostensibly designed to assist first home buyers shouldn't be done in a piecemeal manner. Moreover, home ownership policies must be part of a broader housing policy. So with that, let me conclude, because I'll hand over to my distinguished discussants today, but I do appreciate your time and listening to me. I suspect I've gone a little bit over the 20 minutes that I was allotted, but hopefully that plants a seed of some fruitful discussion later.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. We really appreciate that presentation. Thank you very much. And was drawn to my attention while you were speaking that we have people joining us from overseas on the webinar as well. So you've drawn a bit of a crowd. I'd now like to give the floor to Eliza Owen, who is Head of Research at CoreLogic Australia. Eliza, how did you find that presentation and the research?
Thanks, Tom, and thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. I also want to acknowledge the traditional landowners and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. I just want to commend AHURI, Stephen, and your colleagues on this research. I found it to be extremely comprehensive, tackling what is such a big issue. And I think the paper also lends itself as a really good source of policy recommendation and provides a good foundation for leaders as well. So while the scope of the inquiry was largely focused on the financing of home ownership, one thing that did really resonate with me was this idea of policy needing to move beyond this idea of the monotenurial aspiration of home ownership, given that this research has also demonstrated that in its current state, more people will just never own a home. In the past few years, there was this unearthing of real issues with Australia's rental market, and this is something that has occurred globally as well. New rent values or the value of new leases have increased by 28% since the onset of the pandemic, similar to the proportional increase that we've seen in home purchase values. And that momentum continues in many markets at the moment. We're seeing the most acute demand with the volatility in migration. So while there have been various causes of high rent values over the past few years, at the moment it's really intertwined with the surge in the return of net overseas migration. So historically, your markets that have been exposed to that, inner city Sydney, inner city Melbourne, and some of the western suburbs of both cities, have seen average increases of 18% in rent values since we reopened the borders last year, and that's kind of potentially going to feed into a really difficult conversation around migration, even though it probably shouldn't, given it's a short-term thing. So I think other issues with our rental market is that it is very cyclical in the sense that the provision of our rental housing is determined by the appetite of individual private investors. So obviously, if your interest rate environment is not conducive to that, it halts the supply of rental housing at a time where we desperately need rental housing. Year to date, we've seen about 18% drop in investment loans compared to the same period last year. And if you think about, even though rents have increased markedly by about $200 at the median rent value level over the past year, mortgage payments have gone up substantially more on say, the median dwelling. And again, that's because of the increase in interest costs. And generally, it's harder to reconcile the provision of rental housing as both a social good and accommodation and a sound investment when the capital growth isn't stacking up, when the interest rate isn't stacking up. So I guess that's another dimension of policy that is really important to embrace, to say not everyone will be a homeowner. How do we make our rental system better? And if not everyone will be a homeowner, how do we then grapple with the difference in wealth accumulation between homeowners and non-homeowners? Very important conversations to have. The only other thing I would add, and again, it relates to the cyclical nature of our housing market, is that our ambitions around housing strategy need to remain strong, even in a cyclical downturn. So Stephen notes that in this paper as well, at the time of authoring it, it was a situation where housing prices had come down. First of all, it's important to consider that relative to the upswing. So we saw about a 30% upswing in dwelling values from onset of pandemic to peak, which was April 2022, right before interest rates started going up. The peak to trough decline was only 7.5% nationally by our figures. And through the start of the year, remarkably, despite the fact our underlying cash rate has gone up 425 basis points, housing values have returned to their near previous highs. At this stage, they're only 0.5% off fresh record highs, basically. Again, it comes back to the supply and demand, and it probably would be a higher increase had we not seen the rapid rise in interest rates. But I think there is a danger of latching on to price falls as, policies working around affordability, which is not claims made in this research either. But I think more broadly, politically, that can be a danger as well. So whether the housing market is going up or down, we need to stick to these policy ambitions as well. So that's all I'll say for now, and I'm sure there's a lot more discussion to be had.
Great, thanks so much, Eliza. And I now would like to give the floor to Dr. Marcus Spiller, the partner at SGS Economics. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom, and hello, everybody. And I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country as well. Congratulations to AHURI for this work. I think it shines a light on an absolutely key issue, and it's a long overdue inquiry. In reading through the material, I found myself asking the profound question as to why we have this outsized focus on home ownership in housing policy in our country. And Stephen touched on it a little bit in his presentation. I went back and to my undergraduate reading and read about Bob Menzies wanting to put up a bulwark against the rising tide of communism in the early post-war period. So there was a deliberate pivot on the part of the Commonwealth towards home ownership. Maybe there is a primal desire in our households everywhere for security and continuity in their home environment, and home ownership gives that. So they're all important. I think also we need to acknowledge the fundamental influence that tax policy has had on people's attitudes to different tenures. So we do read quite a bit about the treatment of owner-occupied housing in terms of capital gains tax, its concessional treatment in various means tests in the tax transfer system. But the really big one that doesn't get talked about much, not since 1987 when Joe Flood and Judy Yates did their landmark study on housing subsidies, is the non-taxation of imputed rent. It's true that homeowners do not get tax deductibility for mortgage interest, but they do not pay tax on imputed rent. And when you combine those tax arrangements with the alternative tenure, which is working it out in private rental, where there is no security of tenure and tenant rights are very ordinary, it makes it a no-brainer, really, that if you've got any chance of getting into home ownership, you will try desperately to get into home ownership. And if you feel you're locked out from home ownership under those circumstances, it is a dangerously divisive force in our system. I wanted to contribute today that some of the forces that helped keep home ownership or helped drive home ownership up in earlier generations no longer apply today or are no longer appropriate. So, for example, when when those home ownership rates were pushing up towards 70% and beyond in the 60s, we allowed people to live in substandard housing. By that, I mean we allowed people to move into new suburbs with unmade roads, no curb and channel. They might have had water and power, but they probably didn't have sewer. Some of them even moved into sheds or garages and then organised the build of their houses. So for under various arrangements, people were able to graduate the cost of entry into home ownership as their incomes increased over their lives. Now, we don't allow that anymore. We want people to move into fully equipped houses, and there are very fine and good reasons for that, but we can no longer do it. People are still making trade-offs in a similar fashion to those earlier generations of households, but the quality that they're giving up is access to jobs and opportunities. So our far-flung suburbs today still offer, as they did in earlier periods, a lower price point, but the households moving in there have access to far fewer jobs. I can talk about some of the numbers later if people want. But this is bad from a number of perspectives. One is it's a drag on productivity. So people with skills and qualifications aren't able to access jobs that fully leverage that know-how. So it's bad from that perspective. And it's also bad from a social mobility perspective, because we know that the best predictor of house prices now is in fact access to jobs and opportunity. So the capital gains potential for areas with lesser access to jobs and opportunity is lower than other parts of the city. So that whereas in the past you might have survived your unmade roads and eventually got into home ownership, you were able then to have a springboard to move elsewhere into the labour market. That's possibly no longer the case. You'll probably, if you achieve home ownership in greenfield areas, you may be there for the rest of your housing career. So I just wanted to conclude by sharing some of the ideas that this research prompted for me in terms of policy directions. I think the nirvana is tenure neutral tax policy, but that is a theoretical idea and a bridge too far for the foreseeable future. So I'm not an advocate of that today. There's a number of things we can do. We can start, as alluded to by Stephen. I don't think they made firm recommendations, but we can start by phasing down direct demand side support, which only goes to boost prices if done at any sort of scale. So stamp duty, concessions, first homeowner grants and things like that are really not helping. We should recognise the reality that more people will be spending more time in private rental, either through choice or necessity. And we really need to create a private rental sector that is more professional, better regulated, and offers better tenant rights. So that means a greater focus on build to rent, longer leases, and tenancy reform. It's also very important, I think, to recognise that if we do have a structural shifts that make access to home ownership more difficult, that we really do need to build a sector that offers the same benefits as home ownership in terms of security and continuity of tenure, albeit without the financial or investment benefits. And that to me means growing the social and affordable housing sector to a genuine alternative sector, as in fact was the objective in the first Commonwealth State Housing Agreement before Bob Menzies worked his magic on it. And that means probably growing the sector to about 15% of all housing in our country. We can encourage continuing innovation in tenure models that give some of the investment benefits of full home ownership, but recognising the changed circumstances. So things like, as it's been mentioned, shared equity, but also community land trust models, long leases. And we could even consider quite radical models which perhaps look at cooperatives that are treated like households in terms of tax. so that they too do not pay tax on imputed rent. They too can accumulate tax-free capital gains and share it with their members in the same way that families do now to enable access to home ownership. And finally, we need to flatten the supply curve in housing so that it's a more responsive and efficient sector. Planning is not to blame here, but there are some cost-boosting regulations that we can address. For example, the provision of compulsory car parking, but we also need to improve land supply into housing production, and that means more forthright and direct government involvement. And we can support innovative supply models, for example, co-housing and Nightingale models, whereby people build their own housing and gain something of a cost advantage by capturing the developer's margin. I'll leave it at that for now, Tom. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Marcus. Appreciate that, and appreciate you going into some of those other alternatives and options at the end of your words as well, which does tie back then to, I guess, a couple of questions that we've had coming in, stimulated by Professor Whelan's comments around, should home ownership actually be an objective of policy, or such a strong objective? And since then, both Eliza and Marcus, particularly in the end there, were addressing that. But I do want to throw that one back out there. And, Stephen, you suggested that we were sort of over-egging, putting too many eggs in that particular policy basket, perhaps. Can you, I guess, say a little bit more on that? And I'm interested in Eliza's comments on that as well.
Yes, thanks, Tom. And thanks to Eliza and also Marcus for their comments. I mean, one of the things I took from both sets of comments was, what we need to move away is from this mono tenure model, I suppose, which is, this focus on home ownership as the ultimate objective. And the challenge for us actually as part of the inquiry was that it was around home ownership and financing first home ownership. And so, we had to find a way to talk beyond that. But it makes sense, in the sort of the opening was to say, well, as a policy objective per se, home ownership and maximising it is probably a bad, I say probably, it almost certainly is a bad objective, for, the reasons that I talked about, but also Eliza and Marcus likewise alluded to. And, I think you might have, I'm not sure if you used the term, Marcus, but I think there's an obsession on home ownership by Australians and by Australian policymakers. There are lots of benefits of renting, in terms of mobility, freeing up your wealth, so it's not bound up in this illiquid asset, and arguably provides great opportunities for individuals and households. If you're in Sydney, you would have seen and I didn't read the story, but the headline in yesterday's paper in the Sydney Morning Herald was something like, this person lives in a country where they rent for their entire life and they're not stigmatised and they've got security of tenure, and I think, we often sort of think, let's fix rental tenure, and there's many problems associated with private rental in Australia, but I think we need to think beyond that. It's social housing, but also these, other models which provide for shared equity, for example, but provide security, affordable housing over the life course. And it's going to mean different things for different peoples, and we need to be open to those different alternatives. And I suppose that was hopefully one of the messages we conveyed as part of our inquiry and the findings in it. Can I just add a couple of things, though? And just as sort of a response to the comments, which I think were on the money, so to speak. Mark, as you mentioned, I characterise it as an obsession on home ownership, but I sort of see that as, well, it's a no-brainer. Given the tax and policy settings at the moment, why wouldn't you focus on home ownership and attaining it? Because that's what we're incentivised to do. And that's, for me, is a starting point. All those incentives are wrong, and we need to rethink those. And you did mention about, the policy nirvana, so to speak, in terms of tax neutrality or neutrality, a tenure-neutral tax system. I remember 1987 is when they tried to minimise negative gearing or reduce negative gearing, and I think, the backlash then was probably probably even exceeded the backlash when it was proposed as a policy in 2019. And so, I mean, I don't disagree with you in terms of moving towards some sort of better tax system. And it's a question of where the lowest hanging fruit is. And, you know, tax on imputed rent is probably going to be a very tough one. Tax on capital gains tax on owner-occupied properties, probably also a tough one. But there's other things we can do. And so I think it's, you know, balancing what's achievable with what's going to actually make a difference. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. But yeah, hopefully I've answered your question, Tom. Or, you know, sort of, I suppose what we really want to do is move the conversation away from let's focus on home ownership or owner occupation as a solution. Arguably, it's part of the problem because that's where political parties and the debate's been focused on.
Yeah, Eliza, do you agree?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I do. I largely agree. I think that there are certainly a lot of benefits to home ownership, and you can understand from the prospect of not only wealth accumulation, but security of tenure, lowering housing costs in older age. I think it's the Survey of Housing and Income data that shows that for people over 65, owners have housing costs that equate to about 7% of their income versus 31% for those aged over 65 who are still renting. So that becomes a real problem as well. And I suppose it's about stepping back and rethinking housing more holistically and saying, how do we see it as a social infrastructure, or how do we see it as something that provides affordable, secure places to live? I don't think that policies that pursue home ownership, such as a shared equity scheme, should be mutually exclusive to something like increasing the social housing stock or setting minimum standards for an investor who wants to rent out their property. And holistic too in how we think about, I guess, the interaction with housing and things like healthcare, aged care, how those are funded and provided more accessibly as well. I think it was Judith Yates who did some work into that relationship between home equity withdrawal and where that was increasingly being used for healthcare and aged care as well. So that is a real problem where people are having to rely on the accumulation of value in their home to service them later in life. And yeah, these are the things that keep me up at night. But yeah, I broadly agree with that. I think just looking at it more holistically. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Look, tax settings, you mentioned them, Stephen, and I think all of our speakers have made some allusion to them along the way so far. When we had a panel at our recent National Housing Conference and asked them to comment on those particular tax settings you've mentioned there, Stephen, there was quite an awkward silence that ensued. And I'm just wondering, I mean, everyone seems to be saying, you know, look, it's too hard to touch that. Is that what you're saying? Are you, do you think is this something we need to prosecute again in public discourse, Marcus?
Well, Tom, I think we can make a useful distinction in the whole tax debate between the tax advantages which are given to home ownership,
yep,
and the tax advantages, so-called tax advantages, that are given to investors in rental housing. Now, personally, and I'm not speaking for anybody else, I'm more relaxed about negative gearing in the private rental sector because negative gearing is not a privilege for investing in rental housing. It's a structural feature of our taxation system and applies to investments of whatever kind. So I actually put that in a different basket, and the controversy related to it in a different basket. What I think is more problematic is the fact that we have allowed home ownership to accrete these tax advantages of non-taxation of capital gain, and as I said, non-taxation of imputed rent, which gives it an immense, you have an immense financial advantage if, other things equal, you can own your own home. I mean, if I swap my apartment here and with my neighbour, so that I became a landlord and they became my landlord. Nothing else changed. You know, our two apartments are almost identical. Our tax outcomes would be different. Now, even after allowing for negative gearing and so forth. Now, why should one's tax exposure be driven by one's housing tenure? And the way that we've set things up, you're far more advantaged if you're a homeowner over the full course of your housing career. So I do think, Tom, that you touch anything to do with capital gains tax exemptions, that is poison for a government. And I prefer to think of it in terms of improving tax conditions and security and continuity conditions in the alternative tenures. So rather than, if you like, you could say that it's not dealing with the cause, but I think the most fruitful course for policy is to build a bigger and better social and affordable housing sector, and to build a bigger and better private rental sector, and maybe look at ways in which we can equalise the tax outcomes for tenants so that they have at least part of, they enjoy part of the outcomes that would otherwise come to them were they to be homeowners.
Can we shift the conversation now to the topic of interest rates, which have been in the news a lot, and obviously that is hitting the that younger cohort of first-time owners more than it is older homeowners who have obviously more equity or full equity in their homes. Stephen, I'll go to you first, but while we've got three distinguished economists in the room, it'd be good to, I guess, hear your views on, I guess, the current series of interest rate rises that have occurred, how they're being felt in that younger cohort of new home owners, and what maybe that means for both housing policy, but also economic policy.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'll be honest to say this is a really challenging one, interest rates. And, part of the reason I say that is because I think when we start talking about interest rates and interest rate policy and its relationship to inflation, I see a comment in the chat about this, that it really then sort of alludes to, or sort of leads you down the pathway of thinking about macroeconomic stability and sort of, the appropriate objectives of central banks, and et cetera. So, I think if we simply look at it from the perspective of first-time buyers, or, I suppose households with a relatively young mortgage, so to speak, who, are going to be hardest hit by increases in interest rates, then it does look very inequitable. But against that, I'm not sure that the policy alternatives which have been suggested, temporary increases in GST or temporary increases in tax, would be feasible. That would probably be my first question. I simply think it'd be very difficult to imagine these being feasible. Higher interest rates aren't ideal. I remember when I bought my first home, interest rates were over 8%. And now I appreciate they're over 6%. One of the things I alluded to was changes in the 1980s when interest rates were capped on mortgages at 13.5%. And when that cap was removed, they went up to 17 or 18%. And we hear horror stories about that. I suppose I'm less concerned, but then, I've got a relatively old mortgage, so I'm not being hit by higher interest rates compared to younger homeowners or those who bought a home more recently. I think might be the worst policy, higher interest rates to address a macroeconomic challenge of inflation. Is it inequitable? I suppose it does hit a part of the population, a part of the a group of households who can't do much about it. They're locked into a mortgage. But I'm not sure there's a simple, better way to address a much a much bigger problem, so to speak, which is inflation. So, it's one of these things where you can say, oh, let's just do this. But the feasibility of just doing that, a temporary increase in the GST, for example, would be very challenging, for various reasons. Personally, I'd like to see an increase in the GST, irrespective of the level of interest rates, going back to tax policy, but that's another story for another day. I think interest rates are a blunt instrument. They don't hit everyone equally. We don't hear about those who are benefiting from them, retirees who, during the most recent COVID period, were suffering with basically 0% returns. So there's winners and losers, and it changes depending on where you are in the life cycle. It's probably, in my view, the best-worst policy or worst-best policy. But I'd be interested to hear from Eliza and Marcus about that, because they come from a different perspective in terms of, I'm in academia. I think about the macro policy or the macro economics of it, but, I'd be interested in their thoughts.
Yeah. Eliza, what's your comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I also come from the different perspective of that I'm a recent mortgage holder. I'm a recent first home buyer, and it sucks. It is not fun to have worked so hard to save up a much larger deposit hurdle than was needed by previous generations, only to be hit with a rapid increase in interest rates. We're fine, but yeah, it is a bad feeling, and I can see how people would be reacting to how unequal it does feel. Having said that, I think that the RBA has copped so much for the current cost of living crisis, and not being able to get inflation down, when, like you say, Stephen, they're working with a blunt instrument. And we know that there are ways to bring down inflation around productivity growth, and maybe there's even something in the dissemination of interest rates that you could work on as well. But a lot of it does come back to fiscal policy and the failure of successive governments to enhance productivity growth to help with the current inflationary situation as well. So I don't think there's much else that the RBA can really do.
Marcus, anything you want to say on that before we move on?
I agree with both Stephen and Eliza, really. I think the RBA has precious little option than to do what it has done. And it's a kind of a doubly difficult situation they find themselves in, because, coming out of COVID with people perhaps having stored up some consumption power, the dampening effect of interest rate rises hasn't been quite as potent, or at least not to now anyway. And that sort of makes the whole exercise for the bank difficult. Macroeconomic stabilisation is a higher order goal, really, even than housing policy. And in the long run, the economy has to be run well in order to give us all a shot at a good life. So in a subsidiarity sense, I would be concerned if a particular sector's interests, even though it touches on many, many households, were to gazump the RBA's eye on the greater good. So, that's all I'll say, I think, Tom.
No, thanks, Marcus. Look, thank you all. I want to now switch the conversation to, shared equity as one of the strategies being looked at to enable access to first home ownership by a number of state governments over many years now, and then more recently by the federal government as well. Is this the answer? And what are some of the limitations and risks around these sorts of schemes? Are they, can they be rolled out continuously, or is there some sort of extent to which we'll reach a limitation in terms of how we're able to use that as a mechanism without that then also having unintended negative impacts as well? Marcus, I'll pass to you first on that, if that's okay.
Yeah. Look, I've been around a fair old number of years in housing, and I do recall the first wave of shared equity initiatives in the early 80s, actually, here in Victoria. And one thing that's and over the decades, you know, there have been some private sector initiatives to promote shared equity, and I've been surprised at how little appetite there is to take them up, you know, in amongst home buyers. Now, maybe the game, you know, the situation has become so dire, you know, particularly in markets like Melbourne and Sydney, that as a second best or last resort move, households will take up shared equity. But I have observed over the years a kind of skepticism about it, or the fact that if I'm going to be a homeowner, I'd rather be 100% homeowner and get 100% of the benefits, thanks very much. Or I'd rather rely on, you know, mum and dad or Uncle Jack or whatever to be a shared equity partner with me, or even my friends. So I do have some, I mean, I said in my remarks that shared equity is an important tool, and I'm pleased and glad to see that governments are making these things available. At least it means that households that don't have a rich uncle can have an alternative pathway. But I wouldn't overrate the impact that they will have. I just think there's a resistance to it as a consumer product.
Eliza, what do you think about shared equity? Is this something that has more opportunity in it than has been exploited to date?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Marcus was saying as well, because my understanding of shared equity is that it is meant to be a relatively small scheme, so as not to add too much to the demand side, which is why I think the national shared equity scheme was proposed with relatively few places, 10,000, and I think the Grattan Institute recommendation was that it be even smaller than that. So it is one of my understanding anyway, is that it's one of those schemes that's meant to be targeted at relatively low income people who wouldn't have the same access to the housing market otherwise. In that regard, I think it's a positive thing, but agree that it's not a silver bullet solution. It's one of the many approaches that we could take to try and even out the inequality that exists in accumulating a deposit for a home.
Stephen?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree, but Eliza and Marcus. I mean, so as Marcus was speaking, I was making a comment. I was writing some notes, and I've written, they just aren't popular. They've been around for a long time, and they just simply haven't been taken up. Now, you know, whether it's because, you know, you only get a limited amount of the gains or benefits from a house price appreciation as a part owner, with the government as the other party owner, I think that's focused on, rather than the fact that, you know, you're also limiting your potential downside or risk, you know, the losses that you potentially incur. They just haven't really, I say, grabbed attention, just you know, become part of a norm, so to speak. And I just sort of think back at a recent election. I can't remember where, you know, one party said, well, we want to help you buy a home. The other party wants to help be part owner with you, sort of thing, you know, and sort of tainted it like that. So I think they've got a role, but they're not, as Eliza suggested, going to be a silver bullet, you know. And I think the good thing about it is they can be well targeted. They can, we've seen this in Western Australia, provide an opportunity to transition into full ownership. And, you know, that's good if that's what the household wants. Likewise, it should be seen as good if that's not what they want. They want to remain in a shared equity dwelling. And the only, not so much caveat, the only red flag I suppose I'd raise is that, you know, I think if we are going to go down that path and try to expand it, or even on a small scale, we really need to think carefully about the respective legal rights and obligations and responsibilities of each of the partners. You know, does the part owner have a right to put a nail in the wall? You're not if you're a renter, you are if you're a full homeowner. So, you know, those types of very small things, but also the large things, what happens in the event that prices go down? Can somebody walk away from it and, you know, walk away from their loss? I think it's really important to get certainty and clarity about that. And then they'll have a role, and it may be a small role, but it's part of a suite of policies which will address, I say home ownership, but really housing.
In terms of the history of home ownership that you presented, and Marcus also continued in the discussion, was one of the key features with that shift from a shift more towards intensive use of demand side measures to encourage home ownership. What is the likelihood of, moving away from that and winding back the clock to some degree on that? It does feel that that is very much the focus of policy. Is it feasible to move away from that demand side in terms of home ownership support and indeed just general housing policy support?
No, I'm happy to kick off on that. I mean, one thing I'd say is, I mentioned that part of the problem is the bipartisanship around home ownership, and it becomes almost a bidding war in some sense. How much of a first home owner grant or how much of a stamp duty concession you're about to get if you vote for this person or that person. So I say that's part of the problem. That's part of the challenge. Is there the opportunity to move away from it, or will we move away from it? I think the answer is yes, but we've got to keep having these conversations. I think we've got to keep talking about tax and about what works and what doesn't, incentives we're creating, the unintended consequences of providing aspiring first home buyers with a cash grant. And I know it's always anecdotal, but I just remember 12 months ago reading a newspaper article, and the real estate agent said, "Oh, it's fantastic." Actually, it was around the time of the removal of stamp duty in New South Wales on a temporary basis, and this real estate agent, it's one data point, said, "This is fantastic. All of a sudden, I've got this group of buyers who are coming in and they've got an extra $50,000 to spend," and it was first home buyers. And so I think the more we talk about it, and the more we realise that they can be very counterproductive. The beneficiaries are not those who it's directed at, but it has to be part of a broader conversation around tax and transfer policy, but also housing policy more generally. Then yes, I'm confident we can move forward. I'm old enough to remember the tax summit from 1984, I think, or 83, whenever it was, and that was sort of one suite of taxation changes which occurred, and then we went through debates about GST, Henry Review. And in all honesty, that first one that I remember from the 80s, it was preceded by other proposals to change tax and transfer. I think it's a conversation we just need to keep on having, and eventually changes will be made. They might be slow, they might be a little bit piecemeal, but if we move to something better, we're going to hurt people. I'm all in favour of tax changes which will hurt me, but I think ultimately we move to a better outcome for productivity and for housing outcomes for more people.
Eliza, have we got any hope of winding back demand side responses to encouraging to financing first home ownership?
I really like Stephen's point about it almost being a bidding war. It does kind of feel like that. I feel like if I can allow myself to be optimistic, there is a lot more embrace of the supply side policy under the current government. Housing Accord, which is a stretch target and has its challenges, the commitment to funding more social and affordable housing. And I think that conversation moves forward, unfortunately, when more people do miss out on home ownership and rates decline. And we have to remember too that the millennial generation are very close to being the largest adult population in Australia who will have the voting power. So the more that they're missing out on home ownership, hopefully the more we can have better and more productive discussions about what works and what doesn't.
Marcus, do you want to?
Yeah, look, my point of departure on this question is that whilst we need, and I'm a big advocate of this, build the most efficient housing supply system that we can get, and that involves, regulatory reform. It involves, supply chain improvements. It means, workforce training, etc., etc. My point of departure is that even the most efficient housing market will not deliver enough houses for our country, and that it is essential for there to be a public sector component to the construction production of housing. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be traditional government procurement of, using traditional methods. It can be done through any number of different ways of engaging the private sector. But we need a way of producing housing that is not tied to the housing market cycle. As Eliza pointed out tellingly earlier, we desperately need more houses now. There's never been a time we need more housing construction, but the actual conditions in the market preclude it. You'd be nuts to do medium density housing development in a lot of places because they just don't stack up. So the sooner we come to a realisation that we do need a public sector, reinstate a public sector component to housing production, the sooner we'll be in a position to say that this is a way in which we can offer home ownership to a broader spectrum of people, as in fact we did in the past, as currently occurs in places like Singapore, as pointed out in the reports. So, but this will take, decades, if not years.
Well, thanks, Marcus. That's, I think, a nice segue to what was going to be my last question, because we are sort of getting close to the end of time. So I wanted to give each of you a chance to, I guess, flesh out your thoughts on that idea specifically around supply side interventions, particularly what Marcus has talked about with social housing. Marcus, I think you even mentioned a figure of 15% in your remarks a moment ago, which would be a very big stretch goal for a country like Australia, which has never got anywhere near that before. Eliza, do you agree with this? Is this something that goes hand in hand with a strong policy or a strong structural environment for more home ownership, that we also are providing housing directly as well through social provision?
100% agree. I can't say that I've done the numbers on what that portion needs to be. So if 15% is getting towards the right number, then that's what we should be aiming for. Again, we need to, I think even just philosophically, we really need to move away from the idea of housing as just an asset that can accumulate wealth and something that is a social good, an infrastructure to increase productivity, reduce crime, all of these sorts of things. So, yep, I think absolutely it's the way forward. I wonder slightly if we're going to get too far to the supply side. I feel like maybe we haven't recently had as much momentum around discussions. We've had the concessions, land tax, and it is very politically true with the New South Wales attempt to initiate a implementation of land tax and stamp duty. So I think that's something to be conscious of as well. We don't want to go too far one way or the other. But yeah, I think one of the most obvious fixes for our housing system that most analysts can agree on, we need to increase the steady counter stream of social housing.
And Stephen, can I bring you in on this question as well around supply side responses, and I guess how they relate to the question of home ownership access as well, and the operation of the market?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Tom. And I know one of the contributors to the inquiry, Hal Paulson, has, over many years, I suppose, advocated for an increase in, social housing, for example. I suppose I'm encouraged by, recent moves, both in terms of supply side, social housing, but I think of it more broadly as affordable housing. So it's not that old model of, whatever, the Department of Housing in New South Wales, and I know it's called different things in other
Public
parts of
housing
Australia.
agencies,
Yeah, public, yeah. So I think that shift away. Well, the first step, which is okay, we need to provide and make available affordable housing. Through innovative ways. It might not be us just building houses and developing land, but through other mechanisms. I think is really important. Arguably, it's still pretty minuscule in the grand scheme of things. I think a target of 15%, it might be laudable, but to be honest, I think it's probably not achievable anytime soon. It would require too big a change in the mindset. And so I think what's important is that there's a recognition that there needs to be a more balanced approach to the housing problem, home ownership, which includes provision of affordable housing, other things like shared equity, etc. So I am, enthused. I suppose optimistic on the basis of that. And so I think we just, we need to step back and think about, okay, what are a suite of things we can do? Increases in social housing, affordable housing is going to be one of them. How can we do that to address, I won't say the housing crisis, the housing challenge that we face? So I suppose the short answer, Tom, is yes. I'm not as ambitious, perhaps as optimistic as Marcus with where we might end up. And what I am open to is alternatives. And I think there's different ways we can achieve the same goal. But the move away from pure demand side measures, very blunt ones like the first homeowners grants. I mean, I see it in practice through those targeted low deposit schemes. And I think that's a really positive step and potentially going to free up funds for other things, for investment in social housing or affordable housing.
I have to pick up on the fact that you downgraded our crisis to a challenge, and I'll perhaps give a final word to each of our respondents now, and that might be a segue for them. Are we in a crisis? And yeah, I guess what do you see as the immediate next steps, Marcus?
Yes, so I think we're reaping today the bitter harvest of the major reforms of the early 90s, for which I was an enthusiastic cheerleader. We in I think it was the 1984 Commonwealth State Housing Agreement was the last one that really invested heavily in social housing. If we had have continued to invest at the same rate, social and affordable housing, I mean, we only stigmatise social housing because it's been residualised, but if we had have continued to invest in it, it would be around about 10% of the stock now. So my 15% is actually not a nice to have, it's an essential to have in order for the country to work properly. So I sense that we're at another pivot point in terms of this matter, and we will see a modern revival of a more balanced housing supply sector, which will enable us to have more equitable outcomes for people in all tenures.
Thanks, Marcus. And Eliza, you get the last word. Crisis or challenge?
I think people's experience with the housing market ranges from a mild inconvenience to a challenge to a crisis. And I suppose when we think about the critical areas of the housing market, that has been the cascading from the private rental market to insecure housing, overcrowded housing, homelessness, and looking at the numbers of people who are actually just being turned away from homelessness services, which has increased every year since 2012. That, to me, speaks to a crisis and something that shouldn't be happening in this country. As to what you do about it, I think that there probably is an element of, prioritization that we need to do in the short term in terms of funding homelessness services, social and affordable housing groups as well. But it is something, as Marcus has mentioned as well, the creation of decades of taking our housing market in a certain direction. So it's not something that as a whole system you fix overnight.
Great, thanks, Eliza. And look, thank you all of our presenters today. We've reached the end of our webinar, and I do want to thank Professor Stephen Whelan, Eliza Owen, and Dr. Marcus Spiller for their great contribution to our conversation. And thank you too for the questions that you put forward and for your participation as well. This is our last webinar for 2023, and we look forward to seeing you again next year in the webinars that we have coming up that I mentioned earlier, as well as at our National Homelessness Conference in Adelaide in August. A quick reminder also, we'd appreciate your feedback on today's webinar through the survey that will be sent out to you shortly. And also to remind you that if you do want to catch up on the webinar again or share it with anybody else, it will be freely available on our website as soon as we're able to get it up after today, which will be fairly promptly. So until we see you again online or in person, thank you for joining us. Goodbye.